A small spot of blue light burst out of the canopy. The rain, glazed on every rustled leaf, reflected its azure glow. It fluttered for one beat of its gossamer wings over the trees. Then in the next beat, it ripped through the air toward the sloshing southern Twin Lake. It hurtled through the clouds like a falling star, and the trail of glitter it etched in its wake was reflected in the sea's dark swells. The horizon's once distant features grew close, and soon the turrets of Castle Osmara, lit with 1,000 torches, scaled out of the stormy sea. The sprite leapt over the foaming waves that crashed against the embankments and creaking barnacle-crusted dock. It cleared the crenellated outer wall in a single bound, dashed over the rooftops, and maneuvered between the columns of ash and smoke touted from every chimney. The tiny luminous body's reflection was contorted by the irregular glass that paned every passing dormer window and drowned in the rainwater that drained between the shingles. It was an awkward gravity which caused the dainty ferry to fall toward the towers and apartments clustered within the castle's ominous black battlements. The sprite shrieked and flailed against its plummet past smokestacks and gingerbread trim, but was incapable of stopping. The already enormous stone blocks which walled the inner ward inflated at the irrepressible approach. Only in the last sliver of time before the collision did the air puddle, did glitter explode, was every sense of gravity defied to fling the sprite straight up and into the clouds. Gravity and propulsion negotiated as the ferry ascended into the atmosphere. Velocity was lost as it neared the apex of its pitch. Then the sprite stopped. From its vantage a mile overhead, the panorama of the coast was absolutely serene. Trapped between the conflicting momentums, the sprite was just another sparkle stuck in an already star-studded sky. The careful eyes of the watchmen below were too preoccupied with the meandering moonlighters to notice when the speck of blue light dropped out of the heavens, and their gaze remained averted as the ferry whisked over their shoulders. Only the polished metal of the soldiers' weapons could catch the sprite's reflection as it warped over their curves. The sprite screamed down turrets and past eaves. Sapphire dust bled wherever it scratched the air to fight against its plummet between the towers. Light and sound from the rooms within blasted the ferry whenever it whisked past a window. Then its fall began to sputter. With a swell of apprehension and vertigo, the sprite made a crash landing on a windowsill between the parted casements paned with textured green glass. The light from the lantern spotting the walls overpowered the ferry's glowing aura and betrayed for the first time its emaciated features. The way its skeleton prodded beneath its tautly stretched skin, which had the luster and opacity of dried fruit. With spastic twitches, its bulging eyes perused the room. The chamber's ambiance was uncomfortably artificial. Jagged stones had been cracked and broken to have unnaturally square edges. Trees had been bled of their life-giving sap, sliced up and then fastened together with strips of toxic black iron. The nauseating stench of tempered metal filled the room. The sprite wriggled as heated itches trickled down its back. This would have to be quick, because it could not handle this irritation for too long. A forest of tall, curvaceous glass flasks caught the sprite's curiosity, and it ripped across the room on a trail of glitter to the marble-topped vanity on which they stood. The ferry danced in staccato twitches between the voluptuous glass towers, trimmed with golden filigree and smelling as though they were filled with flowers' nectar. Greasy prints were frosted on the glass as it scaled the bottle. The warping reflection of its emaciated belly bulged as the sprite crawled over the convex surface. Its inky eyes rippled with joy when it noticed its fattened self, but the thrust of its laughing inadvertently toppled the vessel. A cacophony of clanks cascaded around the ferry as the bottles crashed into one another. The minuscule creature bolted back to escape the felled forest of flasks. Its paranoia was quickly dispatched, however, when it noticed the spill at the mouth of one of the bottles. The ferry leaned over the pink puddle, which reflected its luminous blue smile in a purple hue. It took a deep whiff of the perfume's floral bouquet, then chuckled in its descent into lecherous gluttony. Hands splashed playfully in the nectar. Its whole head was dunked in the pool. It gave a shriek, as shrill as fingernails dragged over slate, and fell back from the pink puddle. Ribs heaved beneath the glistening belly skin as the sprite hacked and gagged. Black tears were squeezed from its inky eyes. This was not nectar. Nectar tasted as sweet as it smelled. This was acidic and bitter from distillation. Gossamer Wings puttered the fairy furiously away from the revolting puddle. It shook itself dry, but the flailing and pouting could not remove the astringent. With a splash of glitter, the fairy bolted toward the window. With another explosion of glitter, however, it spun back around. Anxious, urgent pangs contorted the sprite's face. Quickly it returned to the vanity and landed on a bare spot before the large mirror. The fairy marveled for a moment at its reflection, but could not be long distracted from its urgent purpose. The sprite began to pat itself along the length of its arms and torso, then thumped along each leg. Its inquisitive pressing against chest, stomach, and shoulders almost seemed to be a dance. Then, when a tickling finger ran down its back, the sprite broke a broad smile. Its nimble arms stretched achingly around its body. Wings flapped up, then down, tried every combination they could to get out of the way. The sprite started to turn around, under the presumption that this might help it reach that distant spot between its wings. But this, unfortunately, only moved the target further from its grasp. After a frustrated series of spins, the sprite stopped with an arm sufficiently twisted around its ribs. With a strength too awkward for that pose, the fairy pulled from some uncanny orifice an enormous piece of paper which had been artistically creased so that, with a touch of imagination, it might appear as some steed. With a contented smile, the blue fairy danced in a twitchy circle, merrily placed the paper equine on the table, and then bolted toward the window on a stream of sapphire sparks. Iron hinges squealed as the door opened. The metal's aching resonation popped the gossamer film pained by the veins of the blue fairy's wings. Glitter splashed, arms flailed. The fairy wrestled to stay aloft, but could not propel itself any further, and plummeted to the tiles. So my father was left to raise me alone. He would always tell me stories about her, and some days I just wanted to cut my ears off to save them from the monotony of those tales, Terracon confessed, letting Cassandra pass into the room first. The wretched screech of wrung iron ceased as the door was held open, and a moment of freedom was offered in which the fairy could make an escape. The sprite bolted for the nearest vacant hideaway. It dove under the nightstand where the shadows wrestled to consume its azure glow, and painted it as a dichromatic silhouette of cobalt and ash. Clouds of hair and cobwebs were woven in the unfinished, splintered wood beneath the furniture. The fairy paced footprints across the carpet of dirt swept under the stand. The dust pasted itself to the sprite's soles and palms, thirsty for the damp sweat. The furniture's stench of decay and iron were too much for the fairy to bear. It would need another refuge. Its nostrils flared as it made a loud sniff, and burn when it could hardly distinguish any scent over the perfume still polluting its skin. Somewhere in the scent, however, there was something natural, cool and sweet and dank. The sprite's radiance strengthened. Its eyes rippled with delight. It was somewhere above, the scent of fresh water. The fairy crawled behind the nightstand and began to scale the wall. "So it was only you and your father through all those years?" Cassandra asked with an open hand that invited Terracon to take the bed. The heels of her gold snakeskin shoes rapped against the tiles as she made her way to the vanity. "My perfume! Oh, what happened?" She began to fuss with the bottles. "Is everything all right?" "It is fine. You were saying?" "Oh, yes, it was just my father and me." Terracon fell onto the lush mattress. He leaned against the canopy post and watched her as she sat before the vanity and picked the jewelry from her body. "After my mother died, he felt that he needed a simple life, so retired to the farm and raised me." Even at twice its height, the sprite would not stand as tall as the glazed ceramic pitcher placed in the matching bowl on the nightstand's bottom shelf. It smelled so earthy and fresh, and glistened with dewy drops of condensation. The fairy's shattered wings beat with a newfound hope, and it dove from the wall into the pitcher with a grace that neither shook the bowl nor splashed the water. Its surface did not even ripple. As the fairy listened for them to leave, its glow was distorted into ringlets of light that lapped along the pitcher's lip. "Probably the only thing he could raise," Terracon continued. "You should have seen him with that first batch of hens. He certainly had patience. You get that after centuries of training for battle. Those hens, however, worked him to the bone." "So did you enlist to please your father?" Cassandra asked, pulling the pearl stud from her navel. "No, you have to have more motivation in life than to be pleasing," Terracon said. "It was just something I was sure I could do. I was still singeing the bed from nightmares when he handed me my first sword. We would go into the yard, him with a quarterstaff and me with that poorly weighted iron short sword, and he would have me try to attack. It is not hard to learn how to dodge and deliver strikes when the odds are against you like that. Everybody thinks that my father's meddling is why I have been promoted, but the real reason is that I simply have a better grasp on the tactics. Besides, joining Her Majesty's military offers me the chance to develop this. He stared disgustedly into his palms and, uncomfortable with defining his untrained pyromania as magic, changed his tone to one of inquisition. Rage? Cassandra laughed heartily. She turned away from the mirror, her arms reaching behind her head as she peeled the layers of gold fringe from her shoulders, and smilingly exclaimed, Rage? You have the rage of a willow tree. She mockingly swayed the fringe from side to side. Well, what would you call it? Cassandra dropped the shawl to the dressing table and scooted her ivory stool close to the bed. She grasped the footboard and, with a fiery crackle in her eyes, dramatically shouted, Passion! Terracon fought to restrain his chuckle. How about frustration? I can accept that, Cassandra settled. 3 sharp knocks rapped on the open door and quickly drew the attention of the princess and her guard. Osmara stood backlit in the doorway. Anxiety flooded Cassandra's face. Terracon jumped from the bed and bowed. I will take my leave then. Actually, I'm quite pleased to have caught you both, Osmara said. Please stay seated. Cassandra locked her apprehensive gaze on her mother, but Osmara did not return the glance. It bothered Cassandra that her mother detained the captain. What defense for their proximity could be constructed on such short notice? Subtly, Cassandra slid the ivory stool back to its place by the vanity and gracefully descended to its burgundy velvet cushion. Osmara strode into the room. The black velvet train she dragged behind her divided the room into halves and stranded Terracon and Cassandra at opposite ends. The fabric cinched around the queen's knees as she turned around. She swayed her smile side to side to share her warmth equally between them. Terracon ducked into the shadows of the canopy bed and studied her maneuvers from beneath his furrowed brow. Cassandra certainly did not seem happy. Was this another moment for which he was not prepared? Did you enjoy the feast? Osmara asked. Cassandra and Terracon exchanged glances. It was a feast, Cassandra said. Terracon moaned something affirmative and nodded. I'm glad to hear that. Cassandra, you were absolutely stunning tonight. Would you agree, Terracon? Terracon felt any response he would give would be flagrant. It was beautiful. Osmara's pursed lips lifted to a youthful smile. Captain Terracon, you have been in the service of the House of Hexen for many years. You have a proud legacy worthy of admiration. Thank you, Your Highness, he rattled off. Forgive what may seem as impertinence. Please understand that I am a witch of better breeding and age than to ask an unnecessary question. What is the condition of your personal affairs? Mother, Cassandra blurted with shock. Osmara's gaze never left Terracon. She simply signaled a command of restraint toward Cassandra. I am not sure I quite understand. Do you have any current arrangements, engagements, or affairs, romantically with anyone? Terracon's gaze remained averted while the confessions juggled themselves. Could he admit to her the grievances committed with the princess? He felt confident enough in himself to admit to the issue. Some darkness then slithered into him, binding his reasoning facilities in hot, angry coils of insult. Her Majesty had been too disgusted to let him speak earlier, but now she demanded his reply. A few heavy breaths passed before he turned back to Osmara, catching her gaze in his own, matching it with all the rage and potency he could muster. No, I have no such affairs. Something sadistic had been roused in Osmara, evident from her smirk. He had confidence, and his fervency was inviting her. Well, congratulations, then, Captain Terracon. These past days have laid an interesting groundwork for the kingdom. Cassandra turned away from her mother with disgust. How could she bring the topic up like this? Terracon could only gawk as Osmara continued. I am sure that there is not a single person in this castle who has not been entertained by the tale of your adventure, the tale of the fiery, passionate, and beautiful princess who was broken by the mysterious and handsome knight. Broken? Cassandra could not restrain the hurt. So it is with much consideration that I have developed an arrangement which will be comfortable for everyone involved. It is thankful, Captain Terracon, that you are not involved in any personal affair, for now I present you with one to which you can dutifully attend. It is in the best interest of Escambreco that you be betrothed to the Crown Princess, Cassandra of the House of Hexen. The ivory stool tumbled to the floor, and Cassandra screamed, "Mother, what in the demon's desert are you thinking?" "Do not howl at me," Osmara snapped. Her furious focus was broken, however, when a tug on her dress drew her attention to the toe of her boot. Terracon had fallen from the bed to his knees and clenched at the queen's ankle. "Tawesh, my lady, Queen Osmara of the royal house of Hexen, I beg of you, do not bind me by duty to accept this gift. Whatever impression you may hold of the relationship between your daughter and me, a simple servant cannot demonstrate my worth to this honor." Terracon's submission was complete. Guilty men could beg for their criminal lives in no better fashion. "It is an honor to serve the House of Hexen. Remember that as you bear the mantle of Vernalion." Osmara scathingly reiterated the moral of the holiday, then shook her ankle free of Terracon's grasp. His fingers were let to slip from her boot's decorative greave like wet dirt. "How dare you presume to betroth me? There are no barriers to a daughter of Hexen. She cannot be bound." These were her mother's lessons. Surely they had some weight. "You are my only daughter, and I will take what measures are needed to see that you are kept safe. Now I will bid you both good night." Osmara tugged at her train as she strode out of the bedchamber. "You are disgusting," Cassandra shouted after her mother. "It is thoughtless acts like this that curse the House of Hexen." Osmara turned a smug leer toward Cassandra. Thoughtless acts indeed. Barely a breath passed before the space beyond the door was as empty as Cassandra's heart.